Last week, British headlines were dominated by the horrific killing of teenage Southampton student Henry Novak last December. Following the sentencing of his murderer, Vikram Digwa, police body cam footage was released showing their inept, callous, and completely disgraceful treatment of the fatally injured young man. While Novak lay dying at their feet, he was handcuffed and repeatedly pulled around, his cries of, "I can't breathe," completely ignored by the officers. When he told one that he'd been stabbed, the reply was disgusting. "I don't think you have, mate." And to add enraging insult to fatal injury, his murderer stood by, claiming he'd been the victim of a racist attack and pointing to completely invisible bruises on his face. While the country was in a state of anger and despair, Reform UK leader Nigel Farage appeared to use his platform to call for violence, labelling the death of Novak a case of, quote, anti-white racism, and telling his followers, quote, "We should respond to this with pure, cold rage." That's exactly what they appear to do, also goaded on by figures like Stephen Yaxley Lennon, resulting in violent attacks on the police in Southampton last Tuesday, with bins, bottles, bricks, and blazing skips used as weapons. 11 police officers were injured, and so far 14 people have been arrested for the riots. Now, Farage has been roundly criticised for his comments, especially since Novak's father had pleaded with politicians not to use his death to stoke anger or division. And polling from the Makerfield constituency appears to show it might not have done his party any favours, with Labour's Andy Burnham now pulling out even further ahead amongst voters there. But now, one of Farage's supporters in the US has decided to wade in too. US Vice President J.D. Vance posted this on Friday. Henry Novak died the same way a civilization dies, abandoned, handcuffed by authorities who neither trusted nor cared for him, and accused of hate crimes he did not commit. His murder is as tragic as it is enraging. He should still be alive today, and he would be if the last few generations of European elites had stood their ground against the politics of self-hatred and the mass invasion of migrants, many of whom despise the West and the people who love it. On Sunday, Trevor Phillips asked Foreign Secretary David Lammy about those comments.
Vice President of the United States has shared his views about this, and it's well known he's your mate. What did you make of his comments?
Well, I spoke to the Vice President yesterday.
Oh.
And I wanted to emphasise a number of things. The first is that our democratic process is working well. This young man has been convicted. There is an investigation into the police by the Independent Police Complaints Authority. There is an investigation into Hampshire Police by the Inspectorate. The AG is looking at the sentencing in relation to this. The National Police Chiefs are looking at the guidance in relation to this. The second thing was I disagree with him. This has got nothing to do with mass migration. This young man was a Brit. Let's be clear about that. And I said, look, Mr. Vice President, you're wrong about this. And it's also the case that actually murder is coming down in the United Kingdom. So we had an agreeable conversation, but we disagreed.
But it sounds like you gave him a ticking off and told him to keep his nose out of our business.
We had an agreeable conversation because we have got a relationship. But I wanted to make him clear that I disagreed with some of the facts that he was asserting and to present the facts to him.
Ash, a pretty chummy interview there between Trevor Phillips and David Lammy. I wanted to ask you about J.D. Vance's intervention here, because it struck me as pretty mad, to be honest. As, you know, he knows very little about the country, knows obviously very little about the case and the perpetrator involved in it, and yet he's waded in just, days after Nigel Farage has been roundly criticised for, appearing to stoke violence and appearing to use this murder for political ends. Here you get J.D. Vance using it for his own political ends in a way that doesn't actually wouldn't just not make sense to anyone in this country.
Well, what it does is that it breathes a new lease of life into the story that the far right are telling. And I think that with the Southport killings and the conviction of Axel Rueda-Cabana, we are in a new era of how crime is being understood and the role of social media has in amplifying a particular story. Now crime is being seen through purely a racialized lens. And I think there were things that built up to that. It's obviously not the first time in British history that that's happening. But now, if you are in a situation where you have a perpetrator of colour, it doesn't matter if they're born in this country or not, it's being connected to immigration. Even if they were born here, even if they're as British as, anyone in this room, even if they're as British as Nigel Farage, because it's now being seen through this racialized lens. Well, if you stopped immigration, this wouldn't have happened. Now, that's a bit like saying, if only Jimmy Savile's mum had, had an abortion, or if only, someone had left A.B. Hitler, on the hill today. It's an absurd argument, but I think that tells you something about the way in which the lines between anti-immigration sentiment and outright racism are becoming increasingly blurred. What's, I think, so startling about this case is that with Axel Rida Kambana, you had the initial misinformation. This is a small boats migrant. That idea of we're going to explain this by immigration, it doesn't change once it's revealed that he's born in Wales, because then it goes, well, his parents fled the Rwandan genocide. That must have something to do with it. When it comes to Vikram Digwa and the actions of his family as well, who assisted him in the concealment of his crime, Sikhs used to be something of a model minority for the far right. They would constantly be cited by the likes of Tommy Robinson of, well, see, we don't have a problem with, Asian people in general, because look at the Sikhs, they just get on with it.
I think at one time he said we need more Sikhs and less of whoever else he was, objecting to at that time. Yeah.
And it's taken one guy, it's taken one crime. And quite recently, there was a conviction in a case where it was a white British man who killed a Saudi Arabian student. And I've got no idea what the circumstances of the crime. I've got no idea if racism was a motivating factor or not. But the fact that that's not become a story in the same way tells you that race only does the heavy lifting, only does the political work in particular political moments. And I think that what this is really about is punishment for 2020 and Black Lives Matter. Yeah. That's really what it's about. Now, there are going to be some people that really disagree with me about this. I actually think taking a knee for Henry Novak is completely appropriate. And the reason why is this, is because Colin Kaepernick was taking the knee in protest of racialized police violence in the United States, right? That was the issue. And it was a way of saying, we're not really included in this national moment because of this police violence. Now, I don't think that Henry Novak was a victim of racialized police violence, but he was a victim of police indifference. And it was that sort of indifference and that, like, I don't think you've really been stabbed, mate, all that kind of thing, that led to him dying in the kinds of circumstances that could only be completely horrific. So I think as a protest against the police, it's completely appropriate, but that's not why people are doing it. They're doing it because what they've, there is this huge envy that the right have of left-wing movements. And that's why they always use the aesthetics and the language to do their sort of photo-negative version of it. They recognize the power of George Floyd. They wanted a George Floyd of their own, except their George Floyd, Henry Novak, is not being presented as a victim of police indifference. He's being presented as a victim of anti-racism having gone too far.
Yeah. I always think I was saying this to Aaron in the studio the other day, that there's something about the way that these things are kind of constructed on the right, which is kind of like the woke upside down, where it's like, the Black Lives Matter happened because there was a lot of anger around legitimate grievance around the treatment of historically people of color by the police. There's somehow the digging up of some kind of grievance here, which isn't actually the grievance that people have, right? But it's somehow the focus of a kind of energy which mirrors the thing that you might think had an actual grievance at its heart. And the grievance here is one which is, for a lot of people, deeply economic. But that's not a question that Reform can answer, right? No. Because Reform is not actually the party of working class British people of any race, right? Reform is led by a millionaire who sells gold bullion online, right?
Well, I mean, I think there are huge incoherences within Reform. And I think that maybe, the left hasn't quite worked out how to find the vulnerability of Reform. Because when you talk about race and when you talk about immigration, they go, well, these are actually our selling points. Thank you very much. You've just amplified them. But there was this interview that was being done between Nigel Farage and Robert Kenyon, the Makerfield candidate, where Robert Kenyon was driving around Makerfield in a van. And at one point they're saying, well, look, there's a problem for apprenticeships because now you've got to pay the minimum wage for apprenticeships. So, they're sort of dying out. And you can agree with that. You can disagree with that. That's the point they made. And then, not that long afterwards, they're talking about how everything's too expensive nowadays. Make that make sense. So either young people are being screwed over because they're not being paid enough, there's a cost of living crisis, they can't get ahead, or actually the problem is that minimum wage workers are getting paid too much and now that's applying to apprenticeships as well. Like these two things aren't coherent. And I think that they've been astonishingly successful in putting together a coalition where there are divergences in interest and there are divergences of economic interest. Will that be something that they can maintain all the way up into 2029? I actually think yes.
Oh, really?
I actually think yes.
I don't know. I think 2029 is going to be a huge election one way or the other, though, because it's going to be one of the most galvanizing elections that we've seen probably in our lives, actually, where people, I mean, I'm talking about even 1997, which was a big turnout, you know, like people will, I think, really, really turn out in that election in a way we haven't seen. And I think that turnout, the kind of level of protest that there might be at a reform government is not coming through in the polls yet because people aren't yet thinking about it in that way.
I think it's a tricky one, right? There will be a energetic anti-reform vote, but now we've got a reality of five-party politics sitting underneath a first-past-the-post system. You know, you are not going to have many direct competitor seats between the Greens and Reform. You have a lot between Greens and Labour. If you're in London or in city centres around the country, you can pretty much safely give your vote to the Green Party. But there are going to be lots of Labour Reform competitor seats where people will be voting Green because it reflects their values better, you know, economic policy, you know, disappointment and frustration with Labour. So even if you have a very motivated Labour vote, which I think will be a challenge still, but let's say, you know, you get a new leader in, blah, 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 blah. You know, let's say you don't have that effect of a depressed Labour vote, but you do have a Green vote. There is a reality there of that being something which leads to a Reform majority. There's no way to get around it.
Yeah, for sure. Reform UK's leader Nigel Farage may enjoy stoking up Trumpian division in the UK, but there are signs that low down the political food chain, his party is similarly Yankified and trying to inflict it on the rest of us. Last week, Novara Media reported on how Reform-led Essex County Council was banning libraries in the county from promoting Pride and Black History Month. The BBC also reported on it, and this is from their article. Chris Hossack, Reform Cabinet Member for Residents and Community Services, said he wanted Essex's 74 libraries to be neutral spaces for all. Librarians were informed they should no longer promote events on social media channels or by creating bespoke book displays for them during a verbal briefing. Hossack said true equality could only be achieved by removing promotion for all topics. There's a day or a month or whatever it might be for a whole range of things. Not everybody is encompassed in that, he said. When you put a month or a day on for one characteristic, then by default, you're excluding somebody else. There's plenty of opportunity for campaigns and organisations that want to promote International Women's Day and Black history to do that. And what I'm saying is we're not going to do that in our libraries. There have been similar shenanigans in other parts of the country. Last year, Reform-controlled Durham County Council withdrew funding for this year's Pride Parade, with Deputy Leader Darren Grimes saying the event had, quote, morphed into a travelling billboard for gendered ideology and political activism. There's a good news story, though, because the event went ahead anyway last weekend, thanks to contributions from unions, including the Durham Miners Association, with participants calling it bigger and better than ever. Now, that's the kind of solidarity I really like to see there, Ash, a solidarity against this kind of like culture war, Yankified nonsense, right? What do you make of these stories?
I mean, first, the whole thing is pantomime because Reform went big on being an anti-tax party. Every single Reform-controlled council has put up council tax by basically the full whack. And so they say, oh, we're going to recover costs by, you know, defunding woke stuff and, you know, not having any more translators and interpreters available for migrants. Fine, do all that stuff. You're still putting the council tax up by top whack because, you know, there's hardly any money being spent on that. There is an awful lot of money being spent on adult and children's social care, right? That is the really, really big one for councils up and down the country. And there is nothing that Reform have proposed which is going to touch the sides of that funding crisis. But I think you're right that there is a sort of Yankeification. And this is something about America starts turning me into Maggie Smith, right? I start becoming the dowager from Downton Abbey, and I'm like, America, provincials, how dare you?
What's in America?
You know, I'm just like, ugh. But I feel actually quite defensive of like the ways in which England is culturally really different from the UK, dispositionally really different. And it can be things which are really minor. Like, I think it's crazy that in America, grown adults will tell other grown adults, good job. Save that for dogs and children. I think that's an insane thing to say to grown-ups. And so anything from that really small thing to things which are much bigger, which is we've got a very live and let live cultural disposition as a country. And actually, there's been an awful lot of organic social change in terms of people's attitudes when it comes to all sorts of things. So that could be something like interracial relationships and marriages. It could be the acceptance of gay and lesbian relationships. All of those things have transformed an awful lot in my lifetime. And I think that we've got to see these, like, highly vaunted reform, rollbacks on things like, a pride display on a library. I was just impressed that you lot could read. So, well done on making it into a library in the first place, reform councillors. But all of this stuff is about, I think, rolling back on the cultural organic successes of the way in which Britain has become a much more tolerant and inclusive country.
I think there's also maybe the idea that, if you sort of roll back towards kind of like, I don't know, Christian exclusivity in some way about what forms life can take, then you encourage, like, maybe they hope there'll be an uptake in Christianity and a return to like Christian nationalism. Maybe that's,
This is my favourite thing about Restore. So there's a gentleman called Charlie Downs who's very involved with Restore, and he's always on Twitter. And one of the things that he talked about is that, what it really means to be British is to be Christian. And I was like, fine, but it's a really incoherent position to be like anti-immigration, pro-Christian, because your faith is being kept alive by immigration. And that's why London and Birmingham are actually outliers from the rest of the country. The rest of the country is becoming less religious as time goes on. That's being driven by white people.
Yeah. The Church of England is largely African. Like, that is just a fact, right? That's where the largest parts of the Anglican, Anglican community in the world are. Is there's huge populations of Anglicans.
And I think this is also one of the things which is really challenging for nationalists, is that one of the principles of, the big Abrahamic religions is that your faith and your religion and the structure that you're in and the community that you're in is much bigger than a national boundary, right? It's huge. You're in a fellowship of man, and it's something which transcends the nation state. So that's actually another one of those incoherences, which, I would say not the most observant Muslim in the entire world. I find it amusing.
On the idea of pantomime, something I found really funny is that in the Durham County Council case of the Council of Pride, I think the total amount that the council was giving to that was £2,500, which they then were like, no, we've now got to give it to like social care. It's really, that's needed. I mean, that is a drop in the bucket, right? That's not touching any sides. But then they raised 25,000, the union. So, that made for a better price. I mean, I'd love the council to be chipping in, but actually, if people want what they want, they're going to get it. Right?
I mean, look, I actually think that a really good use of council money is anything which encourages people using outdoor space well. And so I think Pride can be a part of that, but I also think like big screens for the World Cup, sporting facilities, all of this stuff is a really good use of council money. And I think that one of the things which has been missing from the left, and I don't see anyone really talking about this, and for all of, Burnham's much vaunted, I'm doing politics in a different way from, everyone who's come before. All he can really talk about is buses. But having a vision of the good life and a good use of public space and social space, that's not something that's in there. And I think that there is something that the Green Party could do about it, and they could speak to the different parts of their coalition. They could talk about access to outdoor space ranging from city parks all the way to, the needs of conservation and access to nature in the British countryside. That's something that they could do. But it's a weirdly missing thing from UK politics. And I think that that's where the sort of knee-jerk nastiness of reform, you look at reform and you go, what do you like?
Yeah.
It's a party whose politics is shaped around one imaginary old man who's yelling at a cloud. And
what they also apparently don't like is stimulating the local economy, right? Because these things bring a lot of, people spend money when they're at a pride celebration or, at some kind of, commemoration for or whatever kind of celebration it is.
You know how much I drank at Durham Miners Gala from 10 a.m.?
I'm not even going to ask.